Well, the idea for the Gloryland project, which was really a CD and a live concert, that was been in my head for a couple years, and it really sort of came into focus in July of 2010. I was in Detroit at the Motown Studios, and if you've ever been there, it's basically a house on Grand Avenue, and behind it is like a garage, a two-stall garage, and they converted that into a studio, Barry Gordy and Smokey Robinson. And then from that point on, that became a place where thousands of songs were recorded. So out of that studio came groups like Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, the Temptations, the Four Tops, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, Supremes, and on and on. So Motown was this incredible music factory, and I grew up in the 1960s in Los Angeles, in Inglewood, and on my street, I was pretty much the only white kid on the street. So there were a lot of vocal groups being formed, people singing together. My next door neighbor, Dorian Holley, he went on to sing with Michael Jackson and Stevie Wonder and a lot of that stuff, but we would make music together. His brother had a piano in the garage, and so I'd be here at my home, and I'd hear the piano playing, and I'd run next door, and we'd start doing songs together. So it was sort of we were both like 8th grade, 12, 13-year-old kids. We started making this music together. So I always had an awareness, along with the Beatles and Simon and Garfunkel and that music that was happening. It was always Motown, gospel, rhythm and blues music that was also part of my upbringing. So what I didn't realize until I started doing research into this whole musical thing was that the Motown sound really was preceded by and had its roots in the music of the black church. Specifically, churches in like Chicago and Detroit in the South, they were already making this kind of rhythm and blues music in the 1940s and the 1950s. You've got groups like the Dixie Hummingbirds, the Blind Boys of Alabama, the Sensational Nightingales, the Soul Stirrers, even someone like Sister Rosetta Tharpe. She was born in 1915, but by the 1940s, she was already playing an electric guitar, kind of a rock and roll guitar, in church. So she was playing rock and roll before we even knew what rock and roll was. But what really began to seal it for me was I was in Israel in 2007 and again in 2010. And it seemed that everywhere I went in Israel, in the Holy Land, I was hearing American gospel music. I mean, I was on the Sea of Galilee on a fishing boat, and over the PA came the sound of "Oh Happy Day" by the Edwin Hawkins Singers. And later on, I was at the River Jordan, and of course, people come from all over the world. Pilgrims come to be baptized there. So people from Japan, Japanese, Ukrainians, Zambians, and they all come to be baptized, and they're all singing the songs of their own religious traditions. And there at the River Jordan was a group of about 100 people from a gospel church in Detroit, and they're singing "Victory Is Mine," what a mighty God we serve. So I came back to the U.S. and I really had a sense that I wanted to do a gospel album because, like I say, I'd been in Israel and been hearing all this stuff. So I called up Deborah Perry, and she went to Calvin. We both went to Calvin. She was at Calvin in the 1980s, and I called her up because she's got a studio in town, and I said, how would you like to do an album, a gospel album with sort of a Motown feel to it? And fortunately, she said yes. And so we began the process. So Deborah Perry owns and runs a studio called Joint Air Music Studios in Grand Rapids. And it's really sort of a hub for a lot of gospel musicians and singers in town. And when I went there, I got very much a sense that it was like Motown was in the 60s. I mean, you've got a lot of musicians all together, jamming together, recording together. And everybody who walks into that studio is really incredible. And so I was able to get with and work with people like Ernie Figures on guitar. We got Shannon Lucky on bass. We've got a drummer, a 17-year-old Shone Williams. We have Tyrese Guyton on the keyboards. He does a lot of work with Marvin Sapp. We got Lamar James is playing B3 organ, and he's sort of the godfather of Grand Rapids gospel. We got Mitch Myers, sort of a funky guitar player, playing electric guitar. and you've got Don Newton on the congas. And then I brought my group into the picture. These are guys that I've been working with at Calvin since 1977. Like Jack DeBoer is my drummer. He's been with me for 35 years. On electric guitar, I got Pete Bardoff. He's been playing with me since 1981. He's from Chicago, born and bred, has really bluesy feel to his guitar playing. And Stuart Poltrock on piano. Okay, then you added that the brass players. Deborah had her guys, Isaac Norris, Tony Spraggins, Troy Anderson, and I had some players I knew, people like Chris Hansen, Chris McKay, Nick Valenziano, Dana Laswell, and Joe Mason on trombone. And then you add Deborah's singers, Majestic Praise, Vanessa Allen, Avalon Cutts Jones, Kristen Moss, Rob Kelly, Kelvin Jackson, Marie Matthews, Dorcas Jones, and the incredible Carolyn Quinn Allen, and Deborah's brother, Gerald Perry. So during the recording process, it was rather simple. I'd walk into the studio with just me and a guitar. I'd sit down in a room, we'd mic up the guitar, and I'd just sing the song. Just one voice, one guitar, very, very simple. So then Deborah would say, well, okay, how can we take this simple song and begin to add a little life to it? So she would add a bass part. She might add a little piano, a little organ. She also could play drums, so she'd add some drums, some congas. And then she'd start singing harmonies, and she wouldn't just sing a harmony, she might sing 3 or 4 or 5 harmonies, all kind of on the fly. You know, and so the songs, which were basically very simple songs, became rather full-bodied gospel songs. And there was no way these songs would have come out that way if I'd just gone into any studio and hired a bunch of musicians and handed out a bunch of music parts and said, okay, let's do the songs. Really, it was Deborah's involvement in the whole thing that made it sound authentically gospel. So most of the process was just Deborah and I together in the studio. Like I say, I'd lay down a simple guitar. She'd start building on it with bass, drums, keyboards, vocals. We would occasionally bring in individual people to play, like certain guitar parts or certain horn parts. And it was about 55 sessions that we were together over a course of about 17 months. So it was a rather, you know, long process, but I like to think of it as sort of a gospel stew. I mean, really, we tried something that was like throwing a little salt, throwing a little pepper, throwing a little oregano, and but through it all, Deborah, you know, was always kind of conscious of what was going in there. So she'd play a bass part, and then she'd know, okay, the organ part should be like this, and then the piano part should be a little bit different. It should be like this. So she kind of always had the big picture in mind as we were in the recording process. And then she'd, like I say, she'd do the vocal part. She'd sing first a soprano part, then an alto part, then a tenor part, then another part, and then she'd teach that to the singers. So really, she sort of had the overall grand view of how the album would be. And like I say, the songs came out very differently than if I'd just been sort of orchestrating the whole process. So it came time to say, okay, let's do these songs live on stage. So we spent a good month, the month of January, February, rehearsing songs. We had about 24 songs that ended up in the final concert. But it was a very fluid process because we didn't have all the parts written out. I mean, the brass parts were sort of written, but everything else was sort of people played by feel. And now, see, Deborah and her group had about 10 songs, and they're much more complex than my songs, but they'd work those up. And then we did have the studio recordings to kind of refer back to. But most of the songs you see in the concert are being performed live for the first time in front of a live audience, and that was a little bit scary. But most of all, it was a very fun and joyful process, and the rehearsals were very up and a lot of laughter. And through it all, Deborah Perry is sort of the glue that holds the whole thing together. She's sort of the quiet leader at the center of the storm, and none of these people would have come together without her sort of orchestrating the whole thing. For me, putting on this concert was one of the biggest productions I've ever done. I mean, we had about 32 musicians. So I knew we might not ever get all 32 people together again in one place for one concert, so I really wanted to have a camera crew on hand to kind of preserve that night and that moment. So through the process, I got to know about 19 new musicians and singers that I had not met before, and Deborah brought them to the table. And the whole process for me was really a stretch artistically, But I was really glad that we had a camera crew there to sort of preserve this moment, because you never know if it's going to be your last concert, and I really wanted to kind of capture that moment. So I'm grateful to Calvin College for the experience of being able to do this concert. You know, I've been doing concerts at Calvin for 35 years, but in some ways, this was the most important one in the sequence of all the stuff I've done. And we've had a chance to do it now at a few churches, which has been fun to kind of bring this music to different communities, different audiences. There were times in the process where I definitely felt like giving up. Like, is this silly? Can I really pull this off? Am I making a fool out of myself? But even though I had my doubts throughout the process, God kept opening up doors and bringing people in, and there was enough positive things happening that made me think, okay, this thing is working. And sometimes in life you can talk yourself right out of something. You can just think too much. I didn't want to do that, but I just had a sense all along that the Holy Spirit was sort of saying, okay, Glenn, keep going. You know, but there's a point where you kind of hear the quiet voice of God in all this. And I just always sensed that God wanted me to keep going. And I'm glad that these songs can see the light of day. So throughout this whole 17-month process, now we have an album and a DVD of the concert that we can share with people, and then we'll just see what God does with it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for a lovely evening. Thank you so much. God bless everybody here.
God bless everyone.